Hi guys, and welcome to Anunnaki Sanctuary's channel. Tonight, we drift into the low, warm air, where the Tigris and Euphrates meet and part and meet again, like two patient ribbons of moving bronze. You taste the river on your tongue, a faint mineral tang, and you hear reeds clicking softly. Moonlight turns the canals into thin mirrors, and each small ripple makes the reflections warble, as if the landscape is trying not to wake you. Some parts of what you are about to hear are widely accepted history. Some parts are interpretation. Some parts are calm, what-if imagination, the kind that feels cinematic but never pretends to be proof. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Also, tiny reality check. You probably won't survive this. Not in a dramatic way, just in the sense that you will fall asleep halfway through and wake up with your phone on your face like a modern blessing you did not ask for. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are listening from and what your local time is right now. It is oddly cozy to imagine all of us scattered across the map, getting sleepy at the same time. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on a riverbank that looks simple at first. Mud, reeds, shallow water, and the hush of insects. Then you notice footprints, pressed deep and purposeful, as if the ground has been practiced. Most historians agree that the earliest cities in southern Mesopotamia grow in a landscape like this, between these two rivers, in what later people call Sumer. The evidence we do have points to a slow, practical pattern. Settlements become larger, canals become longer, fields become more carefully tended under the pressure of seasons. You pick up a lump of clay and roll it between your fingers. It is cool and dense and satisfying, like the world's original stress ball. Clay becomes brick, brick becomes walls, walls become rooms, places to sleep, places to store grain, places to shape pottery, places to count what is owned and what is owed. Archaeology suggests that early urban growth is built from many ordinary choices stacked on top of each other. A path becomes a street because feet keep choosing it. A bend becomes a boundary because it avoids a soggy patch. A cluster becomes a neighborhood because people like living near the same water access, the same work, the same familiar voices. One interpretation is that the emerging order can feel almost too deliberate, as if someone is following a plan that exists before the first bricks dry. A more cautious explanation could be simpler. On a floodplain, water is everything, and water is dangerous. You put buildings where they will not drown. You keep routes open to the canal because you cannot live without it. You reinforce banks because a careless leak can become a hungry current. Practical decisions, repeated year after year, can look like design from a distance. You follow a canal inland. Low embankments guide the flow, and smaller branches split toward fields like fingers reaching for the dark. Irrigation is a mainstream anchor here. What's broadly accepted is that controlling water helps agriculture support larger populations, and larger populations make specialization possible. Someone repairs canals. Someone weaves cloth, someone fires pottery, someone hauls reeds and learns that a basket always looks lighter until you pick it up. Then you reach the part that seems boring until it changes the world. Counting. Counting is not only math, it is agreement. Someone decides what a measure is. Someone decides how many measures equal a ration. Someone decides that a mark on clay can stand in for a promise. In small villages, memory can live in faces and voices. In growing towns, faces blur together, voices move away, so the city craves something that stays, Most historians agree that writing in Mesopotamia develops gradually, likely from record keeping. Archaeology suggests that very early marks focus on goods, grain, sheep, oil, deliveries, rations. They are not romantic at first. They are receipts. Humanity's early written legacy is basically, I gave you 3 goats. You can almost hear the ancient accountants sighing, as if they already know you will argue about the math. You picture a careful person with steady hands pressing a stylus into wet clay. The impressions are wedge-shaped, arranged into patterns that grow more flexible over time. Eventually, those wedges become cuneiform, capable of carrying words, names, and ideas. The evidence we do have points to how powerful this is. Spoken promises fade. Clay lasts, especially when it hardens. Sometimes it hardens because of a fire, which is a strange thought. A disaster can accidentally preserve a document for thousands of years, like history deciding to keep a receipt just to be petty. You walk past low buildings and smell smoke from cooking hearths. You hear quiet talk. The city is not only grand stories, it is routine. A potter turns clay into a bowl. A worker scrapes mud from sandals. Someone carries water and realizes the thing you need is always on the other side of town. Most historians agree that daily life, not only rulers, drives history forward. The evidence we do have points to households and work groups shaping early urban life. Out in the darkness, names gather around places. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash. These names show up in archaeology and later texts, tied to real ruins and real layers of human activity. You do not have to treat them like mythical cities. They are tangible, even if the people who first spoke the names are long gone. Still, when you whisper them in your mind, they feel like words with an echo. One interpretation is that place names can preserve older meanings, like fossils of thought. A careful reading might suggest that naming tells you what mattered to a community. Water access, a local god, a feature of the ground, a craft or identity. To be clear, this is debated. Languages shift, meanings slip, and a name can outlive its original sense. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. You stop near a row of storage jars sealed with clay stoppers. On the seals, you notice impressions, simple symbols that indicate identity or authority. Not quite full writing in the later sense, but close enough to make your mind lean forward. A symbol says, this belongs to someone, and that someone might be a household, an official, or an institution. It is a small thing, but it changes how trust works. You do not need to recognize a face if a seal is accepted. Bureaucracy is born quietly, like a cat sneaking into a room and somehow ending up in charge. Historians still argue whether the earliest cities grow mainly from temple institutions, household networks, or some shifting mix of both. You let that debate sit quietly. You imagine authority forming in the same streets in different ways. A respected household organizes labor for canal repair. A storehouse coordinates rations when the harvest is uncertain. Leadership rises during hard seasons and relaxes when things are calm. The mainstream evidence offers fragments, building patterns, administrative tablets, changes in craft production, and signs of long-distance trade. The interpretation is the story you stitch from those fragments, always aware that stitching is not the same as knowing. Now, the phrase seventh civilization tries to pull you toward a grand secret. Tonight, you keep it softer. What if the quiet suggestion in early Sumerian records is not that something impossible happened, but that something subtle happened inside people? What if, as marks on clay become trusted, the city begins to live partly in symbols? That's a possibility, not a certainty. It is also possible the records tilt your perspective because record makers naturally think record-making matters. You walk to slightly higher ground and look back toward the water. You can sense how fragile this world is. Floods can rise and spread. Drought can shrink canals. Salts can build in soil over long use, making fields less productive. These are mainstream concerns supported by environmental patterns and the logic of intensive irrigation. The evidence we do have points to adaptation, shifting crops, reworking canals, reorganizing labor. The city survives by paying attention. In that attention, the tablet becomes a comfort object. A rectangle of clay says, the barley was stored. The workers received rations. The herd was counted. The transaction was witnessed. Order exists, at least here, at least today. One interpretation is that writing helps people feel reality is manageable. A more cautious explanation could be that writing is simply useful, and useful tools spread. And now, since you are sleepy and the river is whispering, you allow one small imagined scene, clearly framed as imagination. You imagine someone standing where you stand, watching moonlight on the canal, thinking, we are building something that will outlast us. You cannot prove they think that. You only know the canals cut through the plain, and the clay tablets collect names and numbers that reach across time. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You cannot interview the first canal diggers. You cannot hear the first argument over a boundary stone. You can only see the footprints, the bricks, the seals, and the wedges pressed into clay. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You breathe in the damp air, and you let the canal's steady motion teach you its quiet lesson. Patience builds cities, and cities leave marks. You move through a city that seems to breathe in layers, warm air trapped between mud-brick walls, cool air slipping along shaded alleys. The ground under your feet is packed hard by countless steps, and every so often you feel a faint vibration, not from machines, but from people working in rhythm. Somewhere nearby, a reed broom scrapes a courtyard. Somewhere else, water sloshes into a jar. The whole place feels alive in a quiet, practical way. Then you see it. A massive raised structure lifts itself out of the low buildings like a deliberate thought. Not a mountain, not a natural hill, but something shaped by hands that refuse to think small. It is built in stacked levels, wide at the bottom, narrowing as it rises, each tier like a long exhale. Even in the dim light, it commands the skyline. You find your eyes climbing it the way your feet are about to. Most historians agree that temples are central to early Mesopotamian city life, not only spiritually, but economically and politically. Archaeology suggests that large temple complexes are associated with storage, administration, and organized labor. In other words, the holy place is also the paperwork place, which is both hilarious and extremely believable. You can almost picture a priestly official blessing grain and then immediately asking for the correct tally, because the gods might forgive. But inventories do not. You approach the base. The brickwork is rough but steady, like a promise kept over and over. There are buttresses and terraces and ramps, and the geometry feels intentional. One interpretation is that these temple platforms, often called ziggurats in later monumental form, are meant to function as sky staircases, symbolic bridges between earth and the divine. A more cautious explanation could be that height is also practical. Higher ground stays drier. A raised sanctuary is protected from floodwater. A high point is visible from far away, which helps a city announce itself to travelers and rivals. The evidence we do have points to both meanings coexisting, because humans are excellent at building something useful and then giving it a sacred story, or giving something sacred or useful purpose. You put a hand on the wall and feel the warmth stored in the bricks. Your palm collects a fine grit. The air smells faintly of bitumen and dust, and you sense how much labor it takes to raise something like this. Someone digs clay. Someone mixes straw. Someone molds bricks. Someone hauls them. Someone aligns courses. Someone decides the slope of a ramp and the angle of a corner. This is a mainstream anchor that never gets old. Large monuments imply organized work and coordination implies leadership, planning, and shared belief. As you start up the ramp, your steps slow naturally. Because the incline asks you to breathe deeper, you pass people carrying baskets, jars, bundles of reeds, perhaps offerings, perhaps supplies. The line between daily necessity and ritual gift is not always clear. A loaf of bread can be dinner, or it can be devotion, or it can be a wage paid out of a storehouse. Archaeology suggests that temple economies can redistribute goods, paying workers with rations. The evidence we do have points to institutions that manage surplus, and surplus is what makes cities feel possible. You reach a terrace and pause. From here, the city spreads out like a grid that is still deciding what it wants to be. Roofs cluster, lanes twist, courtyards open like quiet lungs. Beyond, the fields flatten into darkness, and canals cut silver lines through the plain. You can see why height matters. If you control water, you control life. And if you can see water, you can plan. One interpretation is that the temple's height is a social technology. When you climb, you feel the city shrink beneath you. People become smaller. Disputes seem less urgent. Authority feels natural when it is literally above you. That is a careful reading of how architecture can shape emotion. It is possible that leaders, priests, or administrators understand this instinctively. A more cautious explanation could be that humans simply like vertical symbols. We build tall things because tall things feel important, and then importance becomes tradition. You continue upward. The steps or ramp edges are worn in places, suggesting constant use. You notice niches and decorative patterns, perhaps painted plaster in your imagination, perhaps colored cones or inlays if you allow the mind to drift. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. At the next level, you see a doorway that leads into a compound. A scent of incense or oil hangs in the air. Inside, you imagine storerooms lined with jars, baskets stacked with grain, textile bundles tied with cord. The mainstream reality is that temples and palaces in Mesopotamia often function as major economic centers, especially in later periods when written records are abundant. In early phases, the details vary by site and era, and scholars continue to debate how centralized the system is at different times. Still, the pattern is persuasive. Big buildings tend to have big roles. You watch an official press a seal into clay on a container stopper. The act is simple, but it transforms trust. A seal impression is identity, authority, and accountability in one small mark. If the container is tampered with, the seal breaks. If the seal is recognized, the goods can move. You do not need to know the person carrying the jar. You only need to recognize the symbol. Bureaucracy again, quietly putting on a crown. Historians still argue whether temples dominate early urban power, or whether households and emerging kings share authority in a shifting balance. You keep climbing, letting that argument float above you like the faint smoke of a lamp. In one scenario, The temple is the city's heart, coordinating work and holding surplus. In another, powerful families compete and cooperate, with the temple as one institution among many. In another, leaders rise as war leaders or canal coordinators, gradually formalizing authority. The evidence we do have points to multiple forces at play. Human societies rarely choose only one steering wheel. They prefer several, and then they argue about whose hands are actually on them. Near the top, you look at the orientation of the structure. It feels aligned, squared, as if it is meant to stand in relationship to the sky. Some Mesopotamian monumental buildings are aligned to cardinal directions, and later, astronomical traditions in the region are well known, though the specifics depend on time and place. One interpretation is that alignment is sacred, making the building a kind of compass, anchoring heaven to earth. A more cautious explanation could be that straight lines are simply good construction, and aligning to sunrise and sunset is an accessible way to keep things consistent without a modern toolkit. You let your mind drift into the mist for a moment, just as a cinematic possibility, not a claim. What if the people who planned this platform watch the stars as carefully as they watch the canals? What if the terrace is not only a ritual stage, but also a place to track seasons, to time festivals, to predict floods, to notice when the moon's pattern feels slightly off? That is imagined mood, and it stays in its lane. You reach the highest terrace, where the sanctuary would stand. The space feels calmer, not because it is magically quiet, but because fewer people are allowed here. Access itself becomes a message. If only some can enter, then entry becomes privilege, and privilege becomes authority. You watch a figure in fine cloth step through a doorway while others wait below. No one needs to speak the rule out loud. Architecture speaks it for them. Here is a mainstream fact that anchors the scene. In later Mesopotamian history, ziggurats become prominent temple towers, and the famous ziggurat at Ur, for example, is associated with the moon god Nana and built under kings of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. That is later than the very earliest city growth, but it shows where the tradition can lead. The earlier temple platforms and precincts, evolving over centuries, create a long architectural conversation. The evidence we do have points to continuity and change, both at once. Your thoughts drift to the idea of a 7th civilization, not as a literal count carved into stone, but as a mood people carry when they stand on a high terrace and feel the world beneath them. One interpretation is that civilizations can feel cyclical. People build, stabilize, expand, strain resources, adjust, and sometimes fragment. Each cycle can feel like a new world rising on the bones of the last. What if 7th is a poetic way of saying, you're living in a layer, and layers have layers beneath them? That is interpretation, not certainty. Now a quirky tidbit arrives, carefully labeled so it does not pretend to be more than it is. A fringe idea proposes that ziggurats are not just temples, but platforms for something else, sometimes framed in ancient astronaut lore or lost technology speculation. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream scholarship generally treats ziggurats as religious and civic monuments rooted in local culture and economy. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes more like a storytelling lens than a historical claim. Still, it is interesting that humans across time look at tall structures and wonder if they were built for more than prayer and politics. Maybe that says more about us than about them. You walk along the terrace edge and feel the wind. It is cooler up here, and it makes your skin prickle softly. Below, the city looks orderly in a way it probably is not. Up close, people argue, barter, gossip, and complain about the heat. From above, it becomes patterns. The temptation is to assume patterns mean control. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You do not know how the average person feels about the temple's power. You do not know whether they experience comfort, resentment, awe, or all three in a single afternoon. You imagine a worker below thinking, "They have the high place, but I have the canal shovel," which is not a revolutionary slogan, but it is honest. And you imagine an administrator thinking, "If one more person brings me a jar without a proper seal, I will personally invent yelling," which is also timeless. That is your second small joke for the night, and it lands softly. Like a pillow, the sanctuary itself, in your mind, holds offerings and symbols, perhaps a statue, perhaps sacred objects, perhaps a platform for ritual meals. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion involves temples, offerings, festivals, and divine patronage tied to cities. Each city can have a chief deity or protective figure, and civic identity can intertwine with cult practice. A careful reading might suggest that when a city says, "Our God is powerful," it is also saying, "Our city matters." That is interpretation, but it fits how humans use religion and identity across many cultures. You linger at the top long enough to feel the paradox. A temple is a place of devotion, but it is also a machine for organizing people. It gathers resources and redistributes them. It hosts festivals that unify the community. It sanctifies authority. It creates an archive of transactions and rituals. It provides a story that makes labor feel meaningful. It can even provide relief in crisis by managing stores. None of this requires a hidden hand from outside history. It requires only people, water, scarcity, and the desire to make chaos feel shaped. Then you let yourself sink into one last cinematic possibility, clearly marked as imagination. What if, on some nights, the top terrace feels like the roof of the world? What if someone stands here and believes they can speak with the sky? Not because they are foolish, but because the sky is the only thing bigger than the city. You can feel how a belief like that could steady the mind. You can also feel how it could be used, like any powerful tool. You turn your gaze down the ramp. The city continues to move, small figures flowing like a slow river of tasks. You take a slow breath and let the height do what height always does. It quiets you. It makes the noise below feel distant. It invites meaning. And it leaves you with a gentle question, not an answer. Is the structure reaching up to the heavens, or is it reaching down into the people, shaping them into a civilization that can hold together? You step into a room where the air feels still and dry, like it has been holding its breath for a long time. Shelves line the walls, and on them sit small clay tablets, each one a quiet rectangle of intention. Some are smooth, some rough, some are neat, some cramped, as if the writer ran out of space and patience at the same time. The light is low, but enough to catch the tiny wedge marks, like rows of footprints that never wash away. Most historians agree that lists are one of the earliest and most common kinds of writing, especially in early complex societies. Lists are not glamorous, but they are powerful. They allow a city to remember more than any one person can hold. And here, in this calm archive space, you sense a different kind of monument. Not brick and height, but memory pressed into clay. A clerk sits nearby, stylus in hand, counting softly under their breath. You can almost hear the rhythm, 1 mark, 2 marks, a pause, then a symbol that means enough. The evidence we do have points to a world where accounting is not a side task but a foundation. Grain counts, sheep counts, labor days, deliveries, rations. If your city depends on canals and coordinated work, you need a way to track who did what and who gets what. If you do not track it, people argue. If people argue, work slows. If work slows, water wins. Then you find a different kind of tablet, one that looks less like a receipt and more like a story pretending to be a record. It is the kind that names rulers, cities, and sequences. This is where the mood shifts. Because you are no longer only in the world of barley and goats, you are in the world of legitimacy. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian scribes compile king lists, texts that arrange dynasties and rulers in order, sometimes connecting political authority to divine favor or cosmic order. These lists have historical value, but they also have agendas. They can elevate one city's line, smooth over messy transitions, and present power as tidy. A careful reading might suggest that the list is less a neutral timeline and more a political instrument. That is interpretation. But it matches how humans use record-keeping in many eras. You trace a line with your finger just above the marks, not touching the clay, just hovering like you do with old museum glass. You see a pattern that makes you blink. Incredibly long reigns attributed to early rulers, tens of thousands of years, sometimes more. As if the first kings are not men, but seasons that last forever. Most historians agree that these exaggerated reign lengths are not literal in the modern sense. One interpretation is that the numbers are symbolic, encoding cycles, mythic time, or a sense that the distant past is vast and semi-divine. A more cautious explanation could be that the scribes are blending different traditions, or using a numerical language of prestige, where long means important, rather than counted year by year. The evidence we do have points to this mixture. The king list contains both names that can be correlated with other records and names that feel mythic, like figures who belong to epic rather than office. You let that sit in your mind like a slow spinning coin. The list is both a bridge and a fog bank. It connects you to real cities, real lines of authority, and real political memory. It also drifts into a realm where time stretches like a dream. Now a tablet mentions a flood. Not a simple seasonal overflow, but a flood with capital letters in the imagination. A flood that divides time into two, before and after, the way trauma can split a life. Flood stories are widespread across Mesopotamian literature, and it is broadly accepted that they reflect, at least in part, a landscape where flooding is a real and recurring threat. The rivers can be generous, and they can be terrifying. People who live with water long enough learn respect, and sometimes they write that respect as myth. Historians still argue whether specific flood narratives preserve memory of one major event, several regional floods, or simply a mythic pattern built from frequent local disasters. You can feel how easy it is to step wrong here. If you treat a myth as a newspaper report, you fall into fantasy. If you treat it as meaningless, you lose the human truth. So you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that floods happen. Canals break. Embankments fail, and settlements can be damaged or abandoned. The mist is the grand framing, a single world-ending wave that resets everything. One interpretation is that myth takes many experiences and shapes them into one dramatic narrative, because the mind prefers one big story over 1,000 small ones. That is plausible, though never absolute. You walk deeper into the archive and find a tablet that is less list, more poem. And yet it still feels like it is trying to hold something historical. It names places. It names gods. It names a survivor. You do not need to treat it as literal to feel its weight. People are saying, in their own way, that the world can be destroyed and it can be rebuilt. And in a land of rivers and silt, the metaphor is never far from the physical. Then you notice another thing. The scribes do not write only to remember. They write to arrange reality. A list can shape what counts as legitimate history. If your city's dynasty is in the sequence, you belong to the story of power. If you are left out, you become a footnote, even if you were important for a century. This is mainstream in the sense that record-keeping often reflects the values and politics of those who control it. One interpretation is that the king list is a kind of spell, not magic with sparks, but social magic, words that make order feel inevitable. When it says, "Kingship descended," it frames power as something that moves like a sacred object, passed from city to city, as if the universe itself is endorsing the handover. A more cautious explanation could be that it is simply a rhetorical style, a way to justify shifting dominance in a landscape of competing city-states. Either way, the phrasing is not neutral. You find yourself staring at the numbers again. The long reigns tempt the mind toward wild ideas. This is where a fringe idea likes to show up wearing a dramatic cloak. A popular rumor claims that the early rulers are not symbolic at all, but records of beings who lived far longer than humans, perhaps because they were not human. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream readings treat those reigns as mythic or symbolic. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mirror for a question. Why do humans so often imagine a beginning filled with giants and semi-divine figures? The answer might be psychological, or it might be political, or it might be both. You keep your tone gentle and your footing careful. We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues. The evidence we do have points to an important truth. Scribes are not passive. They are active shapers of memory. They decide what gets copied, what gets preserved, and how events are framed. In a world where clay can last millennia, the person who writes can influence how the future sees the past. That is a quiet kind of power. You imagine a scribe leaning back, rubbing their wrist, eyes tired from wedge marks. They are not thinking about you. They are thinking about their supervisor, their ration, their next tablet. But even so, their choices ripple outward. They choose one version of a list over another. They standardize a spelling. They include a city, omit a rival. They place a flood line like a hinge between errors. A careful reading might suggest that the structure of the list is as meaningful as its content. That is interpretation, but it is the kind that can be tested by comparing copies and looking for patterns. You step toward a corner where older tablets are stacked, some chipped, some cracked. The edges feel fragile, but the marks endure. It makes you think about time itself. The city measures time in seasons. Harvest cycles, lunar months, work days. But the texts sometimes speak in grander spans. In the imagined world of myth, time becomes elastic. It stretches, compresses, folds. Here is a mainstream anchor that keeps you steady. Early Mesopotamian societies developed complex calendars and administrative timekeeping. Tied to agriculture and temple or civic organization, even if myth speaks in vast ages, daily life still runs on counting months, ration days, and seasonal tasks. The extraordinary numbers do not erase the ordinary routines. You drift to the doorway and look out. Outside, the city continues in its practical rhythm. A donkey brays, offended by existence. Someone laughs. Someone shouts for a child to stop chasing a chicken like it owes them money. And you think, yes, this is how it is. Grand lists and flood epics exist alongside spilled water jars and missing sandals. History is not one tone. It is a chorus. You return to the tablets one last time and let the mood settle into a single question. What if the seventh civilization idea is not a literal claim, but a feeling created by texts like these, a list that reaches so far back it becomes myth, a flood that divides eras, numbers that stop behaving like modern numbers? One interpretation is that scribes are signaling depth, saying the present sits on layers of meaning and memory. A more cautious explanation could be simpler. They are using the language of grandeur to legitimize the world they live in. Both can be true without requiring hidden machines or secret visitors. You touch the clay lightly, then pull your hand away, as if you are respecting a sleeping animal. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You cannot look into the mind of the scribe. You cannot stand in the flood itself. You can only read the marks and weigh their intentions. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And in the quiet of this archive, with the city breathing outside, you let the long rains soften into something less like a puzzle to solve and more like a lullaby of deep time. You step into a cool interior where lamps make soft halos on plastered walls. The air carries a mix of smoke, oil, and something herbal that clings to the back of your throat. It is quiet in a way that feels managed, as if silence here is part of the routine, like sweeping a floor, sealing a jaw. On a low table, a tablet waits, still dusty at the edges. Its marks look confident, like the writer has done this 1,000 times and is not in the mood for your questions. You lean in anyway, because this is where names start to feel like doors. Most historians agree that Sumerian religion includes a rich pantheon of gods, each linked to forces of nature, aspects of society, and the identity of specific cities. The evidence we do have points to a world where divine names are not decorative. They organize life. They structure festivals, offerings, oath, and the way people talk about luck and loss. When the river behaves, someone thanks a god. When it does not, someone asks what they did wrong. Humans are wonderfully consistent like that. You notice one cluster of names that keeps coming back in later discussion: the Anunnaki. In many popular retellings, that word gets treated like a simple thing, like it means one clear group with a clear job description. A more cautious explanation is that ancient terms often shift meaning across time, city, and context. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. One interpretation is that Anunnaki can refer to a set of deities associated with the divine assembly, sometimes tied to the underworld or broader cosmic authority, depending on the text and era. That alone is already enough to make your mind wander, because anything that sounds like a council of powerful beings will attract imagination like a lamp attracts moth. You picture a ceremony. Priests move with practiced calm. Offerings are arranged: bread, beer, dates, maybe a small portion of meat when circumstances allow. A hymn is recited in a tone that feels both intimate and official, like a lullaby that also files paperwork. This is mainstream ground. Temples serve as ritual centers, and ritual is a social glue. It brings people together, coordinates calendars, and gives meaning to labor. If you have to dig canals under the sun, it helps if the universe seems to care. Now you let a careful reading take you one layer deeper. One interpretation is that some divine names can function like titles or offices, not in a modern corporate way, but in a mythic administrative way. A storm god is not just a character, it is a way of talking about storms as a force with a personality you can negotiate with. A city god is not just a statue, it is the city's identity, pride, and fear made speakable. In that sense, gods can be language tools. They turn the unpredictable into something you can address. A more cautious explanation could be simpler. People worship gods because that is how their culture understands the world, and the stories grow naturally over generations. You do not need hidden mechanics behind it. You only need humans doing what humans do, building meaning. Still, your eyes keep returning to the name Anunnaki because modern ears hear it and immediately want it to mean visitors. You can feel the temptation to leap from religious text to science fiction. Tonight, you do not leap. You walk. You look at how texts place divine beings into relationships. Some are parents, some are children, some are rivals, some are helpers, some are judges. The structure mirrors society. Kings have courts. Cities have councils. Families have hierarchies. One interpretation is that the divine assembly is a reflection of political reality, projected upward. That is not an insult to belief. It is a description of how humans map what they know onto what they cannot fully control. Then you notice something subtle. In some myths, divine decisions shape kingship, legitimacy, and the fate of cities. The evidence we do have points to a strong link between religion and governance. Most historians agree that rulers often claim special relationships with gods, and cities frame successes as signs of divine favor. When a city wins a conflict, it is not only a military victory, it becomes a cosmic endorsement. When a city suffers, it can be framed as a divine displeasure, which conveniently encourages people to obey reforms, pay offerings, and stop doing whatever the authorities say caused the problem. Humans are also wonderfully predictable like that. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian gods should be read mainly as literal objects of worship, as symbolic personifications of forces, or as evolving blends of both. That debate matters here, because it determines how you interpret mysterious-sounding terms. If you assume everything is literal, you can end up treating poetry like an engineering manual. If you assume everything is purely symbolic, you can miss how real and immediate belief is for the people living it. The solid ground is that they worship, ritualize, and organize around these names. The mist is what those names might imply beyond their culture. You stroll past a niche where a statue might stand. The face is idealized in your imagination, eyes wide, hands folded, even if you have never met this person. You know what the pose is saying. I am watching. I am attentive. I am not going to miss the rules. Somewhere in the city, someone is paying for that statue. Someone is feeding it offerings. Someone is chanting for it. Someone is cleaning dust off its shoulders like it is a relative who never helps with chores. Now the mysterious thread, a fringe idea, proposes that the Anunnaki are not gods at all, but advanced beings, sometimes cast as extraterrestrial visitors who influence early civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, and there is thin evidence for it in mainstream scholarship. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic lens. What if ancient texts are describing encounters with something unfamiliar, using the only vocabulary they have? The reason it remains fringe is straightforward. Mythic language is flexible, and it fits many interpretations, without independent evidence. The leap stays a leap. You keep your feet on the floor. You also allow your mind to look out the window, because imagination is allowed as long as it stays honest about being imagination. So you do a gentle what if. What if a small group of outsiders arrives in the distant past? Not necessarily from space, but from a far region with different skills and customs. To local people, they might seem almost divine, simply because difference can look like power. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Another cautious explanation could be that trade networks bring new ideas gradually, and myths later dramatize that slow change into stories of gods descending. Both can be true as storytelling patterns without requiring literal visitors from the sky. You pause near a scribe who is copying a hymn. The scribe's hand is steady, but their eyes look tired. That is your first small joke in this section. Even the divine needs good handwriting, and honestly, that feels like a lot to ask before breakfast. The scribe presses wedge marks into clay, line after line, and you realize copying is a kind of devotion. It is also a way of controlling meaning. The version that gets copied becomes the version that survives. You listen to the words in your mind without quoting them. They praise, they petition, they describe power. The text frames gods as active agents in the world. A careful reading might suggest that these hymns are also political tools, reinforcing which deity is honored, which temple holds prestige, which city stands at the center of the cosmic map. That is interpretation. But it fits the evidence we do have about temples as institutions. You walk through a courtyard where offerings are being prepared. People speak softly. There is no frantic energy, only routine. Religion here is not a weekend hobby. It is a continuous relationship with risk. Floods, drought, illness, rivalry, and uncertainty all press in. If a ritual makes the world feel slightly more stable, people will do it. If an offering makes the heart feel less alone, people will do it. And if a myth explains why things happen, people will tell it. You notice how gods in Sumerian tradition can overlap, merge, or be reinterpreted across cities and centuries. The evidence we do have points to fluidity. A deity's role can expand, contract, or shift depending on political change and cultural contact. One interpretation is that divine names sometimes function like flags. When a city rises, its god rises in stories. When a city is conquered, its god can be absorbed, re-ranked, or reframed. A more cautious explanation could be that people simply adapt belief to new realities, as they always do. Now, the name Anunnaki sits in that fluid system. If it refers to a group within divine hierarchy, then its meaning can drift too. That makes it a poor candidate for rigid modern claims, and a great candidate for modern fascination. You step toward a wall painting in your imagination, something symbolic, stars, animals, a boat, a horned crown. Horned crowns show up in Mesopotamian iconography as a sign of divinity that is mainstream and broadly accepted. It is also visually striking, which means the internet loves it, which means it will be overinterpreted, which means you need to breathe and stay calm. Horns in art can signal status, not biology. That is the cautious line. Here is your second light joke. If ancient gods wear horned crowns to look important, you can hardly blame modern people for trying to put impressive accessories on everything too. The only difference is that today it might be a luxury watch, and nobody is offering barley to it yet. Hopefully. You return to the tablet table and consider what Sumerian records quietly suggest. If you listen with patience, they suggest that humans are desperate to make order, and brilliant at building it. They suggest that power likes to dress itself in sacred language. They suggest that myth is not the opposite of truth, but a different way of handling truth, shaping it into something memorable. And then you allow a third gentle joke, soft and sleepy. You imagine a god looking down at the endless human debates and saying, "I created storms," not comment sections. It is comforting to remember that even if the divine assembly is mythic, the human habit of arguing is very real. Now you end with one more cinematic possibility, clearly framed as imagined. What if, on certain nights, the temple singers choose a hymn that feels older than the bricks? What if the words carry an echo of a time when cities are smaller, and when the rivers are wilder, when the first planners are still guessing. In that echo, the Anunnaki name might feel like a shadow moving behind the curtain of language, not proof of anything, just a sensation that the past is deeper than the stories that survive. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You can confirm that people wrote these names, sang these hymns, built these temples, and organized life around the sacred. You cannot confirm exactly what every term meant in every context, or whether later interpretations have warped earlier meanings. So you stay gentle. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are calm imagination. And you let the lamplight flicker on the clay, as if the marks are still drying. You step into a space that smells like damp clay and reed matting. A classroom scent that is both humble and oddly serious. The room is not grand, it is practical, with low benches, baskets of tablets, and a few lamps that make the shadows behave. A thin layer of dust clings to everything, the kind that settles when people do careful work for hours and hours. A student sits cross-legged on the floor, shoulders tense, stylus poised like it is about to accuse the clay of something. Their tablet is fresh, still soft enough to take clean marks. They press a wedge, then another, then pause, squinting as if the clay is arguing back. You recognize the look immediately. It is the universal face of learning, half determination, half disbelief that anyone expects this to make sense. Most historians agree that Mesopotamia develops scribal education, with students learning to write by copying lists, signs, and model texts. Archaeology suggests that many tablets found are exercises, including repeated signs, simple word lists, and eventually more complex compositions. The evidence we do have points to training that is structured and demanding. Writing is not a casual skill here. It is a profession. It creates administrators, record keepers, legal specialists, and the people who will shape what a city remembers. You pick up a practice tablet and feel its slight weight. It is small enough to hold easily, but heavy enough to remind you that knowledge can be carried. The stylus marks are uneven. Some wedges are deep, some shallow. The student is still learning pressure and angle, the way a musician learns timing. It is strangely intimate to see a mistake preserved. In modern life, errors get erased, deleted, overwritten. Here, a slip can harden and survive for thousands of years. That thought is both comforting and mildly terrifying, like realizing your group chat might become an archaeological artifact someday. A teacher moves through the room, not rushing, but not gentle either. Their eyes flick from tablet to tablet, reading the marks like a doctor reading a pulse. You can feel the discipline in the air. The teacher taps one student's tablet and the student sighs, then reworks a line. The sound of styluses pressing clay becomes a soft percussion, like rain that has decided to be organized. This is the mainstream anchor. Early writing is learned through repetition, and repetition shapes culture. The evidence we do have points to standardized training that helps stabilize language, administration, and law. If a city needs records that make sense across departments and generations, it needs people who can produce consistent writing. You do not get that by hoping everyone just figures it out. You get it by school. One interpretation is that these classrooms do more than teach writing. They teach obedience, hierarchy, and the idea that rules are real. A careful reading might suggest that the classroom is a miniature city. The teacher is authority. The tablet is the contract. The student learns that mistakes have consequences, not because anyone is cruel, but because mistakes in records can cause conflict. If you write the wrong ration count, someone goes hungry. If you write the wrong boundary, someone fights. A more cautious explanation could be that education is simply a way to train specialists, and any social discipline is an indirect effect rather than the main goal. Both ideas can be true at the same time. People build systems for practical reasons, and the systems reshape how people think. You watch a student copy a list of signs over and over. It looks monotonous, but then you notice the hidden complexity. Each sign has a form, and form carries meaning. The student is learning to see the world as categories: types of grain, types of animals, types of containers, measures, numbers, names. In a way, they are learning to see the city as data. That is not cold. It is a kind of clarity. It is also a kind of power. The teacher sets down a second tablet beside the student's work. This one has the correct forms, a model. The student compares, adjusts, tries again. You can almost feel the tiny shift in confidence when a line finally looks right. That moment is timeless. You know it from learning anything difficult. Your brain clicks, and for a second, the world feels more understandable. Now you notice something else that the evidence suggests. Many scribal exercises are not only signs, but also lists of words and phrases that reflect daily life, people, places, objects, professions, animals. Not the grand things first, but the ordinary scaffolding that holds a society upright, even without telling a story. A word list quietly reveals what matters. A careful reading might suggest that the curriculum is a snapshot of values. If students spend time copying terms for grain and beer, those resources matter. If they copy terms for labor roles, those roles matter. If they copy place names, the map matters. It is interpretation, but it is grounded in the way curricula everywhere reflect priorities. Then you spot a tablet with a different feel. The writing is more playful, the layout less formal, like someone relaxed their shoulders. Maybe it is a student getting bolder. Maybe it is a teacher demonstrating something beyond accounting. This is where the room becomes more interesting, because writing is not only for counting. Writing can carry complaints, jokes, insults, and little sparks of personality. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian texts include proverbs, dialogues, and literary compositions, and that scribal training eventually includes copying such works. The evidence we do have points to a tradition where students learn not only to write, but also to think in recognized forms. Praise hymns, letters, legal statements, and moral sayings. That means the classroom is also a factory for culture. It produces the phrases and structures that people will later use to talk about right and wrong, order and chaos. Historians still argue whether scribal education mainly serves state and temple control, or whether it also creates a broader intellectual class with room for creativity and critique. You let that debate hover in the lamplight. On one side, the school can be seen as a tool of institutions, training people to maintain systems of rationing, taxation, and authority. On the other side, literacy can open mental doors, even within strict boundaries. A literate person can compare texts, notice inconsistencies, and preserve ideas across time. That can support authority. But it can also subtly challenge it, not with loud rebellion, necessarily, but with the quiet power of knowing how the story is constructed. A student nearby tries to hide a small grin while scratching something into the corner of a practiced tablet. The teacher does not notice, or pretends not to. You lean closer in your imagination and see a doodle, perhaps an animal, perhaps a caricature of someone's nose, perhaps something that is more symbol than picture. Archaeology suggests that some tablets include doodles and informal marks, though the specifics vary. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth. even in strict classrooms. Students find ways to be human. Here comes your first small joke for this section. Soft and sleepy. You imagine the teacher discovering the doodle and giving a look that says, "You can invent writing, but you cannot invent getting away with that." The student, of course, perfects the ancient art of looking innocent while holding a stylus like it is purely decorative. The room continues its rhythm. Stylus taps, quiet murmurs, occasional sighs that are half exhaustion, half determination. You realize that these schools are also places of silence, and that silence has a shape. It is the silence of concentration, of learning, of being careful because the teacher can see your mistakes. In that silence, the city's future is being trained. One interpretation is that the scribal school is where the city learns to speak to itself in a consistent voice. A careful reading might suggest that standardized writing reduces ambiguity, which reduces disputes, which increases stability. That is interpretation, but it is logical. Records become shared. Reference points. If two people disagree, a tablet can settle it, at least in theory. In practice, people still argue, because people are people. And that might be the most stable fact in all of history. You move to a shelf where older student tablets are stacked. Some are broken, the edges chipped, others are intact, hardened by time. You notice that different hands have different styles, even within standard forms. A wedge can be sharp or soft. Lines can be tight or spaced. The marks reveal personality in the same way handwriting does now. The student who presses too hard might be anxious or over-eager. The student who keeps perfect spacing might be meticulous. The student whose lines drift might be daydreaming about lunch. Now you find a tablet that looks like a letter practice. It has the shape of a message: greeting, request, explanation. This is a new development in the room's mood because letters are not only data, they are relationship. Most historians agree that letters become a major text type in Mesopotamia, showing communication between officials, merchants, and family members in later periods with abundant texts. In educational contexts, model letters train scribes in formal language. The evidence we do have points to a culture that values proper phrasing, status markers, and formulaic respect. One interpretation is that learning letter forms teaches social navigation. The student learns not only how to write, but also how to position themselves in hierarchy, how to address a superior, how to request resources, how to complain without sounding disloyal, how to sound confident without sounding arrogant. A more cautious explanation could be that letter formulas are simply practical conventions. Still, conventions shape behavior. They train the voice that will later shape decisions. You hear two students whispering, comparing signs, trading tips like little conspirators. One says a sign looks like a bird footprint. The other says it looks like a tiny arrow. They giggle quietly, then go back to work, trying not to attract attention. Your second joke arrives gently, even thousands of years ago. Students clearly invent mnemonics that make sense only to themselves, and somehow they are convinced it is genius. Then the teacher introduces a more complex exercise. The students copy a short proverb or moral saying. You watch their expressions shift. Lists are predictable. A proverb requires understanding tone. It carries a lesson. It hints at how adults want the world to be. The evidence we do have points to proverbs and wisdom texts that offer social guidance. Work hard. Respect authority. Avoid arrogance. Be cautious with words. In a city, words can start fights, and fights can break systems. So wisdom becomes a kind of maintenance. A careful reading might suggest that these moral sayings are also anxiety management. They tell people how to behave in a world where status matters, where resources can be scarce, and where the gods, in local belief, can reward or punish. That is interpretation. But it fits how moral literature works in many cultures. It helps people cope by turning chaos into rules. Now the mystery thread, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that some ancient training texts preserve coded knowledge, like secret instructions hidden in plain sight, meant only for insiders. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most educational tablets look like exactly what they are: practice, repetition, and standard forms. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a fun lens for noticing patterns. Maybe certain phrases repeat because they are effective teaching tools. Maybe rare variants show local traditions. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm about classroom intent. Did teachers ever slip in private messages, personal jokes, or subtle critiques? It is possible, but it remains speculative without clear proof. You walk to a corner where a student is working on a tablet that includes names, personal names, place names, titles. Suddenly, the room feels less abstract. Names turn writing into identity. When you can write your name, you can claim responsibility, ownership, and presence. Most historians agree that writing names is a key part of administration, sealing, and accountability. The evidence we do have points to seals and signatures functioning as early identity systems. One interpretation is that literacy creates a new kind of self, not in a dramatic philosophical way, but in a social way. The written name becomes a stable token. You can be recognized beyond face-to-face contact. A more cautious explanation could be that the written name simply supports existing social roles. Still, the effect is meaningful. The city expands, and writing helps people remain legible to one another. Your third joke drifts in softly. You imagine a student practicing their name over and over, enjoying the power of it, like signing an autograph for an audience of clay. Then they realize they misspelled it on the 5th attempt. And the clay does not care about your feelings. The teacher claps once, not loudly, but enough to shift attention. The lesson ends. Students set tablets aside to dry. Some will be reused, re-wet and reshaped. Others will be stored, kept as records of progress. You look at the stack of student work and feel a calm awe. Not because it is mystical, but because it is human. This is how a civilization trains itself. Quietly, repetitively, patiently. You let the room's quiet settle into a final thought, gentle and grounded. The evidence we do have points to scribal schools as engines of continuity. They preserve language. They preserve standards. They preserve the ability to manage complex systems. One interpretation is that they also preserve the city's inner voice, the phrases and structures that make power feel normal. A more cautious explanation could be that they preserve skills, and the broader effects are unintended. Either way, the result is the same. Clay holds more than marks. It holds habits. As you step out into the night air, you do not need a grand secret to feel the depth of what happens inside that classroom. You only need to imagine the student pressing wedges into clay until their hand cramps. Then trying again. Somewhere between the mistake and the correction, the city becomes more durable. Some parts are documented. Some are interpretation. And some are gentle imagination. And in the hush that follows the last stylus tap, you feel a quiet suggestion that is easy to miss. Civilizations do not only rise through kings and monuments. They rise through lessons, copied lines, and the slow training of attention. You walk along a canal edge at dawn, when the air is cool enough to feel like a fresh sheet pulled over the day. The water moves with a slow confidence, but the banks are crowded with signs of stress. Freshly packed mud, reed bundles tied for reinforcement, and footprints that do not wander. They march. You can tell, without anyone announcing it, that maintenance has become urgent. Most historians agree that Sumerian city-states compete over resources like the water, farmland, and trade routes. The evidence we do have points to a landscape where a small shift in canal control can change a city's survival chances. A well-placed diversion can water fields or starve them. A broken embankment can flood homes or expose crops to drought. In a world like this, politics is not abstract. It is measured in wet soil and full granaries. You follow a work crew moving toward a gate. They carry baskets of clay, coils of rope, wooden tools, and the kind of determined silence that comes from knowing the task matters. Ahead, walls rise from the flat plain. They are not decorative. They are thick, functional, and a little intimidating. Like the city is wearing armor because it learned the hard way that polite intentions do not stop a rival. Archaeology suggests that many Mesopotamian cities build walls, ditches, and controlled entrances, especially as competition grows. The evidence we do have points to more than fear. Walls organize traffic, taxation, and authority. A gate is a choke point for traders, travelers, and carts. If you control the gate, you control who comes in, what comes in, and what gets counted. Security and administration often share the same doorway. You step closer to the wall and notice repair marks. New brick courses sit beside older ones. Some bricks are stamped, some not. That detail matters because it hints at organized building programs and centralized oversight, especially in later periods when royal inscriptions are more common. Even without reading a single mark, you can feel what this implies. Labor is being directed, resources allocated, priorities decided. One interpretation is that warfare is not only about fighting, it is about shaping the city's internal economy. When the threat of conflict rises, leaders can justify larger projects, stricter rationing, more controlled distribution, and tighter discipline. A careful reading might suggest that fear can become a fuel. People work harder when they believe the alternative is disaster. That is interpretation, but it is a pattern seen across many societies. A more cautious explanation could be that walls and mobilization are simply practical responses to real threats, without any cynical manipulation required. You walk through the gate and into a corridor that narrows the flow of bodies. Guards stand to the side, not aggressive, just watchful. Their presence is a message. The city is not only a community, it is a machine that needs protection. In the marketplace beyond, goods move in clusters, baskets of barley, bundles of wool, jars sealed with clay, lengths of cloth, copper items that catch the light. Trade is a lifeline. Losing a route is like losing an artery. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian city-states rely on trade for materials not locally available, such as metals, timber, and certain stones. The evidence we do have points to long-distance exchange networks. When a city controls a route, it gains wealth and influence. When it loses a route, it becomes vulnerable. This makes conflict feel almost inevitable. Not because people enjoy it, but because survival depends on access. You pass a group of officials near a storage area. They are not wearing uniforms in the modern sense, but their posture and authority are obvious. They supervise loading, count containers, and record movement. You can sense the invisible thread between economic management and military readiness. A city with organized storage can feed workers, fund building, and sustain defenders. A city without it cannot. Then you notice something sharper. Stories are being told in the streets. Not epic poetry, just practical talk. This city did this. That city stole that. Someone broke a treaty. Someone diverted water. These narratives build identity. They turn complex disputes into simple moral shapes. A careful reading might suggest that conflict stories double as political branding. They paint rivals as villains and leaders as protectors. That is interpretation. But it fits how humans create cohesion. When people believe they share a threatened identity, they cooperate more easily. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian warfare is mainly driven by resource competition, elite power struggles, or shifting alliances that can change faster than the tablets record. You let the debate settle like dust. It is easy to imagine one clean cause. But real conflict is usually tangled. Water matters, prestige matters, trade matters, personal rivalries matter, religious legitimacy matters. And sometimes, pure misunderstanding matters, because humans can turn a small insult into a multi-generational grudge with impressive efficiency. You walk toward a canal junction where the water splits. The banks here are reinforced, and you see markers embedded in the mud, perhaps boundary indicators, perhaps points for measuring flow. This is mainstream ground again. Controlling water is central. The evidence we do have points to canal systems being both engineering and a politics. Whoever decides where the water goes is, in a sense, deciding whose future exists. Now you hear a low drum beat, not musical, more like signals. A group is assembling. Men and women carry supplies. Some carry tools that can be used for building or defense. The distinction is not always sharp. A pick can dig a canal or break a wall. A cart can haul grain or haul stones. In early city-states, many labor roles blur in times of stress. Your mind tries to picture battle, but tonight stays calm and non-graphic. You do not need gore to understand stakes. You can keep it PG-13 and still feel the tension. A city under threat becomes tighter, louder, and more watchful. Children are pulled indoors earlier. Dogs bark at shadows. People speak in shorter sentences. A messenger arrives with news, and the crowd leans in. You do not need the exact words to feel the effect. The city's mood changes. The marketplace quiets. People look toward the wall. Fear is an emotion, but it also becomes a schedule. It changes who sleeps, who stands guard, who stores grain, who travels, who stays. One interpretation is that leaders can use this moment to reshape society. Emergency can justify new taxes, forced labor, confiscations, and political purges, though the details vary by era and city. A more cautious explanation could be that communities accept sacrifices because they are necessary, not because they are manipulated. The evidence we do have points to both possibilities existing across history. Institutions can protect people. Institutions can also protect themselves. You follow a patrol walking along the inner wall. The walkway is narrow. The view outward is wide. In the distance, the plain looks empty, but you know emptiness can hide movement. The city's defenders scan for dust clouds, for unusual birds, for smoke. They are reading the landscape like a text, the same way a scribe reads clay. That is your first small joke here. Gentle and sleepy. Everyone is trying to be literate in something, and the wall guards are practicing fluency in suspicious horizons. You come to a small shrine near the wall. Offerings sit in a neat cluster. It reminds you that belief and defense are intertwined. A city may ask its gods for protection. It may interpret victory as divine favor and loss as divine anger. Most historians agree that religion and politics are deeply interwoven in Mesopotamian societies. The evidence we do have points to rulers and institutions using sacred language to frame authority and events. A careful reading might suggest that invoking gods during conflict helps unify people and justify hardship. Again, that is interpretation, but it aligns with how ritual supports social cohesion. Now the mystery thread enters carefully. Like a whisper, you do not mistake for a shout. A popular rumor claims that some Sumerian conflicts hide a deeper story, a kind of civil fracture disguised as war with outsiders, or even a metaphorical war among divine factions that later storytellers interpret literally. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to ask, could some conflict narratives be symbolic? Encoding political upheaval, drought crises, or internal rebellion in mythic language. That is not a claim. It is a lens. You keep walking, and you notice something undeniably real. Supply lines, donkeys, carts, porters, and officials. War, even in early city-state forms, is expensive. It consumes grain, tools, textiles, and time. A city that mobilizes too often can exhaust itself. The evidence we do have points to conflict having economic consequences, sometimes visible in shifts of building activity, administrative patterns, and settlement changes. You stop at a workshop where metal is being worked. Sparks jump like tiny insects. Copper items are shaped into tools, maybe weapons, maybe fittings for carts. The craft is practical. It is also strategic. A city with access to metal and skilled workers can outfit labor and defense more effectively. Trade ties again, because copper is not always local, and timber for charcoal may not be abundant. Everything links to everything. Cities do not fight in isolation. They fight inside networks. Here comes your second small joke. Soft and modern. You imagine a quartermaster staring at a pile of supplies and thinking, I can handle rival city-states, but I cannot handle paperwork. Then you remember that in this world, paperwork is literally wet clay, and you silently thank the universe that you do not have to carry your inbox in a basket. As the day progresses, you sense that the real battlefield is not always outside the walls. It is inside decisions. Who gets extra rations? Who gets assigned to wall duty? Who stays to harvest? Who travels to negotiate? Who speaks for the city? The evidence we do have points to administrative systems that make these decisions possible. Without them, defense collapses into chaos. One interpretation is that the city's leaders present conflict as a simple story to keep morale stable. This side is righteous. That side is greedy. We are defending our water. We are defending our God. We are defending our children. A more cautious explanation could be that people genuinely believe these narratives because they contain truth from their perspective. Both can coexist. Belief is rarely only propaganda or only innocence. You walk to a place where a treaty might be discussed, perhaps near a temple precinct or an administrative courtyard. The air here feels tense but controlled. Negotiation is another form of conflict management. It is cheaper than battle, but it requires trust, and trust is fragile. A careful reading might suggest that written agreements and recorded oaths become tools to stabilize relations, at least temporarily. The evidence we do have points to the growth of administrative writing supporting more complex diplomacy and conflict resolution. Now you let yourself drift into one cinematic possibility, clearly marked as imagination. What if, in the middle of all this practical struggle, someone writes a narrative that makes the city feel eternal, even when it is frightened? What if they describe enemies as chaos, and their own walls as the boundary of order? That is not a secret coded truth. It is a human habit, turning vulnerability into meaning. You take a slow breath and listen to the city's sounds. Hammer taps, footsteps, water pouring, low conversations. The city is not collapsing tonight. It is adapting. It is tightening its grip on water and walls and words. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm about intention, whether leaders are more reactive or more calculating, whether stories are more sincere or more strategic, whether conflicts are more about survival or prestige. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You end this walk with a simple, grounded feeling. Most historians agree that early city-state competition helps shape Mesopotamian politics, fortification, and administration. The evidence we do have points to a world where fear and organization grow together. One interpretation is that this pressure cooks societies into more complex forms, like heat-hardening clay. A more cautious explanation could be that complexity also creates new vulnerabilities, and each solution creates new problems. Either way, the walls stand, the canals flow, and the city keeps counting. Because survival is never only about strength. It is about staying organized when your hands are tired. You step into a small temple room where the air feels cooler than outside, as if the walls have learned how to hold night inside them. A lamp burns with a steady, patient flame. The light is gentle, not bright, and it makes the corners soft. The floor is swept clean, but you can still smell old incense, old oil, old reeds. It is the scent of repetition, the scent of a place where people come when they need the world to make sense again. On a low stand rests a tablet with a story pressed into clay. The marks are neat, the spacing careful. Like the writer knows the text matters. You do not read it like a modern person hunting for spoilers. You read it like a listener, letting the rhythm of the language guide your breathing. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths are not just entertainment. They carry religious meaning, social values, and cultural memory. The evidence we do have points to stories being used in rituals, in education, and in shaping how people think about power, love, loss, duty, and fear. And in this room, the story that seems to gather the most gravity is the descent of Inanna, also known in later traditions as Ishtar, a goddess associated with love, sexuality, and war. Depending on time and place, you picture Inanna not as a distant marble statue, but as a presence that changes the air when she enters. She is not mild, she is not quiet. She is the kind of figure who walks into a room and makes everyone pretend they were not just gossiping. In myth, she decides to descend into the underworld, a realm ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. The underworld is not painted as a fiery torture chamber in the modern sense. It is more like a heavy place, a place of stillness, a place where status and brightness fade. As you follow the myth, you notice how carefully it is structured. Inanna approaches gates. At each gate, a piece of her regalia is removed, a crown, a rod, a necklace, items of power, dignity, identity. Gate by gate, she is reduced until she stands bare of symbols. What's broadly accepted is that this stripping at the gates is part of the story's core pattern, and that such patterns in myth often connect to ritual logic. One interpretation is that the underworld journey functions like an initiation, a controlled symbolic death that leads to renewal. A more cautious explanation could be that the story dramatizes the vulnerability of even the highest power. Inanna is formidable, yet she is not immune to cosmic rules. You let the image settle slowly, a figure of authority, losing markers of authority one by one. It feels uncomfortably familiar, like watching someone lose titles, wealth, allies, confidence, and then realizing you have seen versions of this in every age, including your own. The myth does not need modern psychology to be effective. It simply knows how power feels when it is taken away. In the story, Inanna reaches the underworld and faces judgment. She is struck down, and her body is left like a thing that no longer commands attention. The telling can be stark, but tonight you keep the tone calm and non-graphic. You do not need detail to understand the emotional shape. The underworld is where brightness stops being protected by the world's usual rules. Most historians agree that many ancient myths explore cycles of death and return, connected to seasonal patterns, political transitions, and ritual needs. Archaeology suggests that in Mesopotamian religion, rituals and myths are often intertwined, though the exact performance context for specific myths can be debated. The evidence we do have points to these stories being meaningful frameworks for communities facing uncertainty. Now a careful reading starts to suggest something more internal. One interpretation is that Inanna's descent is a map of collapse and recovery inside a person or a society. The gates become stages of loss. The underworld becomes the period when normal tools do not work. The return becomes the slow rebuilding of identity, but not in the same form. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth is primarily theological, explaining divine relationships and cosmic order. With psychological resonance as a side effect, both can be true without conflict. You look around the room and imagine someone from the city listening to this myth during a hard season. Maybe the canal water is low. Maybe a family member is sick. Maybe a conflict has disrupted trade. Maybe crops have failed. The myth would not fix those problems, but it would offer a pattern. It would say, even the greatest can fall into darkness. And darkness is not always the end. Historians still argue whether the descent myth should be read mainly as a ritual text tied to seasonal cycles, as a political commentary on power and legitimacy, or as a broader psychological allegory that later audiences naturally recognize. You breathe in softly. That debate is the respectful way to approach the text, because it refuses to flatten it into one meaning. Myths are rarely single-use tools. They are multi-use rooms, and each generation rearranges the furniture. Now the story shifts toward rescue. Inanna's allies seek help. Messages are carried, strategies are formed. In some versions, clever beings are created and sent to the underworld, not to fight, but to empathize, to mirror grief, to offer the right words at the right moment. This detail is striking because it suggests that force is not the only key to locked gates. Sometimes the key is recognition. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths often emphasized negotiation, divine protocol, and the binding power of cosmic rules. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where even gods operate inside systems of obligation. One interpretation is that this reflects a society that depends on rules, contracts, and institutions. A more cautious explanation could be that it is simply good storytelling, because rules create tension and resolution. You follow the rescue sequence with a slow heartbeat. It feels like a manual for how to survive when brute strength fails. You do not rush. You do not demand. You match the mood of the underworld. You speak the language of the place you are trying to change. Here comes your first light joke, gentle and sleepy, even in the underworld. It turns out the fastest way to get results is not to barge in like a hero, but to use emotional intelligence, which is honestly inconvenient but probably true. The myth also involves exchange. A return from the underworld often requires a substitute, a balancing act. This is not presented as cruel for cruelty's sake. It is presented as a cosmic accounting. Something must equal something. A life moving upward is a weight removed from the underworld, and the scale demands balance. The mainstream anchor here is that ancient Mesopotamian thought frequently frames order as maintained through balances, exchanges, and obligations, whether in economy, ritual, or mythic logic. The evidence we do have points to a cultural comfort with the idea that nothing is free, not even divine favors. One interpretation is that this exchange reflects social realities. When someone in power returns from disaster, someone else may pay the cost. Families, workers, rivals, or scapegoats can be pulled into the accounting. A more cautious explanation could be that the exchange is symbolic, reflecting seasonal replacement, like vegetation cycles, or the movement of a deity's presence between realms. Either way, the myth is not simple comfort. It is comfort with teeth, but not the scary kind, more the honest kind. You feel the story's inner geography taking shape. Gates are boundaries. Regalia is identity. The underworld is a zone where identity dissolves. The return is reconstruction. If you treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the myth starts to look like a guide for endings. Not an instruction sheet in a modern sense, but a patterned reassurance. Endings have steps, and steps can be walked. Now you notice how the myth is also political if you tilt your head slightly. Inanna is not just an individual. She can represent a city, a temple, a regime, or an institution. When a city falls on hard times, it loses symbols. When it recovers, it regains them. Sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through sacrifice, often through a mix of both. A careful reading might suggest that the myth normalizes the idea that power can be lost and regained without the world ending. That is interpretation, but it is plausible. You imagine a priest reciting the story as part of a ritual calendar. The people listening are not analyzing like scholars. They are feeling, they are hearing the shape of fear and hope, and letting it steady them. The evidence we do have points to myth functioning as emotional infrastructure. Roads move goods. Myths move meaning. Both are necessary for a city to stay coherent. Here is your second joke. Soft and modern. You realize that if you ever had to pass through 7 gates where someone takes your accessories, you would be furious by gate 3 and would absolutely leave a 1-star review for the underworld experience. The myth, however, remains dignified, and you admire its patience. Now the mystery thread enters, carefully framed and clearly labeled. A fringe idea proposes that the descent story encodes something more literal, like a record of an ancient catastrophe, a hidden ritual technology, or even a description of altered states induced by temple practices. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to ask gentle questions. Could certain mythic details mirror real ceremonial experiences, like controlled fasting, isolation, or sensory ritual that produces visions? It's possible that rituals shape storytelling, but it remains speculative unless supported by clearer evidence. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground. The myth exists, it is structured, and it reflects a worldview of rules, exchanges, and divine hierarchy. Mist. Any claim that it is secretly a literal technical report. The story is powerful without that. You look again at the gate-by-gate stripping. It feels like a lesson in humility, but also a lesson in focus. When everything is taken away, what remains? The myth seems to answer. The self remains, but changed, and the world's rules remain, even if you hate them. One interpretation is that this is a coping strategy for a society living with unstable rivers and unstable politics. If your environment can shift dramatically, you need a mental framework that can hold dramatic shifts. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth arises from theological creativity and spreads because it is emotionally compelling. Both are reasonable. You listen to the room. The lamp crackles softly. Outside, you hear distant footsteps and a donkey complaining about reality, which seems to be its favorite hobby. The city is awake. And yet in here, time slows. You sense how stories like this could be told in a steady voice, night after night, until their shapes become internalized. Your third joke comes in gently. You think about how ancient people copy myths onto clay, and you realize that means the earliest form of saving your work is literally baking it, which is a productivity technique you might consider, except your laptop would not appreciate it. You return to the core. Quiet suggestion. The descent myth, in its calm structure, may function like a coded inner geography, not because someone hid a conspiracy, but because humans naturally encode experience into story. It is possible that the story points at a truth about collapse when you lose symbols. You feel stripped. When you enter darkness, you feel judged. When you return, you are not the same. The myth does not pretend otherwise, and now you allow one short cinematic what if, clearly marked as imagination. What if, on a night when the city feels fragile, a listener hears the myth and realizes that the underworld is not only a place below the earth, it is any place where your usual identity does not work. A hospital room, a drought year, a political upheaval, a private grief. The listener does not name it, but they recognize it. And in recognizing it, they feel less alone. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm about how each listener understood the myth. Did they hear theology first? Did they hear politics? Did they hear personal survival? The evidence is thin on inner feelings, so you stay gentle. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are calm imagination. The tablet sits quietly, holding its wedge marks like a steady pulse, and you let the story do what it has always done best, not prove anything, but offer a path through darkness that can be walked one gate at a time. You enter a workshop that smells like hot clay, smoke, and something sharp like ground minerals. The air trembles slightly with tapping and scraping. A potter's wheel turns slowly, and nearby a small furnace breathes, pulling air in and pushing heat out like it has its own steady lungs. The room is busy without being frantic, the way skilled work often is. People here know what their hands are doing, and that confidence is its own kind of calm. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia shows impressive practical technology for its time: irrigation engineering, standardized measures, pottery production, metalworking, textile weaving, and large-scale construction. The evidence we do have points to gradual improvements and shared techniques across regions. No single miracle is needed. You can get a lot done when you have time, pressure, and a reason to coordinate. A craftsperson lifts a finished pot and taps it lightly. The sound is clear. A good ring. Another worker checks a small weight stone, then sets it beside a balance. The scene feels ordinary, but it is where many mysteries begin, because ordinary objects survive, and later people look at them and wonder what else they could have been. You step toward a shelf where odd items rest. Some are broken, some intact. A small copper piece with a tube-like shape, a glassy bead, a polished stone that catches the lamplight just right. You feel the temptation to label everything as advanced, secret, or out of place. Tonight, you do not do that. You let the objects be what they are first. You start with the mainstream anchor. Ancient crafts can be sophisticated without being anachronistic. Skilled artisans can produce precise work using simple tools and careful repetition. Now the whispers begin, but gently. Archaeology suggests that people in Mesopotamia used lenses or lens-like objects in some contexts, though interpretations vary. Polished stones can magnify slightly, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of polishing. The evidence we do have points to craftsmanship capable of producing smooth surfaces. One interpretation is that some artisans might notice magnification and use it to see finer details in carving or inlay work. A more cautious explanation could be that many polished objects are decorative or symbolic, and any optical effect is incidental. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You hold a polished piece up to the lamp in your imagination. The light shifts, not dramatically, but enough to make you feel a tiny thrill. Humans love tiny thrills. We see a small effect and immediately ask if it changes the story of everything. Sometimes it does, often it does not. Still, the question itself is part of the fun. Nearby, someone works on metal. Copper is shaped with heat and hammering. The glow is soft, not violent. The craftsperson quenches a piece in water and steam rises, then disappears. You realize that early metallurgy, even without modern theory, is already a kind of practical chemistry. People learn what heat does. They learn what repeated working does. They learn what mixing metals can do, especially in later periods when bronze becomes widespread. The evidence we do have points to experimentation guided by results. Then you notice a little cluster of jars, some clay, some perhaps bitumen-lined. This is where a famous modern talking point sometimes tries to enter the room. The idea of ancient batteries. A fringe idea proposes that certain jar-like artifacts, often discussed in popular culture, function as primitive batteries capable of generating a small electric charge. This theory isn't widely accepted, and scholars debate the interpretation of such artifacts, including whether they are related to storage, ritual, or other practical functions. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a thought experiment. What could ancient people do if they discovered a small electrical effect? Perhaps through metals and acidic liquids. But the evidence is thin, so you keep it in the mist lane, not the solid ground lane. What's broadly accepted is that many claims of surprising ancient technology are overstated when removed from their archaeological context. An object can look mysterious in isolation, but context often explains it. The evidence we do have points to everyday explanations, frequently being more likely than extraordinary ones. That does not make the past less interesting. It makes it more human. Historians still argue whether some unusual artifacts represent misunderstood everyday tools, rare specialist devices, or later misinterpretations shaped by modern expectations. You let that debate sit like a warm stone in your palm. It is not a debate about whether the ancients are smart. They are clearly smart. It is a debate about what specific objects were for, and whether modern eyes are projecting too much. You walk toward a work table where a craftsperson arranges tiny pieces for inlay, maybe shell, stone, and colored material. Their fingers move slowly and precisely, like they are solving a puzzle with their hands. This kind of artistry can look almost modern, and it can inspire the feeling that something must be missing from the story. But the mainstream truth is simple. Skill accumulates. If you do a craft for generations, you get good at it. Very good. One interpretation is that the beauty of these objects becomes a kind of evidence for organized training and specialist workshops. A careful reading might suggest that certain cities host concentrated expertise. supported by temple or elite patronage? A more cautious explanation could be that artisans operate in networks of families and apprenticeships that do not need centralized control to thrive. Both can be true. Now the room offers a new kind of oddity: pigments and glazes. Someone mixes crushed mineral with liquid, creating a paste that catches light differently. Color is not only decoration. Color signals status, ritual significance, and identity. The evidence we do have points to ancient use of pigments and materials like lapis lazuli in elite contexts, often acquired through long-distance trade. That fact alone is worth sitting with. The city is not isolated. It is connected to far mountains and distant routes. A bead on a necklace can be a map of relationships. Here comes your first small joke in this section. Gentle and sleepy. You imagine a merchant traveling weeks to acquire a precious blue stone, only to return and hear someone say, "Nice. But do you have it in a slightly different shade?" The merchant quietly decides that civilization is a mistake, then continues trading anyway, because profit is a stronger force than despair. You move to a corner where tools hang. Simple tools, but clever: drills, abrasives, measuring cords, straight edges. This is the mainstream anchor again. Precision can come from careful measurement, not advanced machines. A taut cord can create a straight line. A plumb bob can create vertical accuracy. Repeated templates can standardize production. The evidence we do have points to methods that do not require modern tech, only patience. Now, because the title of tonight's theme invites mystery, you allow a cinematic possibility, clearly framed as imagination. What if a master artisan discovers a trick, a technique, a minor breakthrough, and keeps it within a small circle, not because it is alien, but because knowledge can be a competitive advantage? A guild-like secrecy can exist informally, passed from teacher to apprentice, guarded by pride and livelihood. That is a possibility, not a certainty. You look at a small set of weights again, and you realize how revolutionary standardization is. If two people agree on measures, trade expands. If trade expands, specialization expands. If specialization expands, complexity grows. That chain is mainstream and broadly accepted in many historical contexts. But here is the twist. Standardization also creates the illusion that the world is fully measurable. A careful reading might suggest that once people start measuring everything, they begin to trust measurement more than experience. That is interpretation, but it is psychologically plausible. Now the second joke drifts in softly. You imagine an ancient official insisting that a jar is short by a fraction of a measure, while the potter swears it is fine, and the whole argument continues until both forget why they started. If you ever wonder whether bureaucracy is modern, you can relax. It is ancient, and it is thriving. You step outside the workshop into a courtyard where sunlight is beginning to heat the ground. You see finished goods being stacked, traded, moved. The city is a circulatory system. Goods flow like blood. Blocks of time are measured by production cycles. The evidence we do have points to economic organization that can feel surprisingly complex. Now the mystery lane returns with one more careful glance. A popular rumor claims that certain ancient sites contain traces of technology too advanced for the time, sometimes described as lost sciences or forgotten machines. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often relies on cherry-picked artifacts without context. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a reminder to ask about gaps. Not every tool survives. Not every organic material lasts. Not every workshop is excavated. It is possible that some techniques are lost, but lost does not mean extraordinary. It can simply mean perishable. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist, solid ground. Artisans produce sophisticated work. Trade networks move materials, and practical engineering supports cities. Mist claims that a handful of odd objects rewrite the entire timeline. The evidence is thin for the biggest leaps, so you do not make them. Your third joke arrives gently. Like a pillow landing, you imagine someone in the city inventing a clever device, showing it off proudly, and then immediately losing the instructions tablet because they set it down near a pile of other tablets, which is the ancient version of saving a file to your desktop and never finding it again. You pause and let the courtyard quiet in your mind. The workshop behind you continues its soft noises. The city continues its daily rhythm, and you consider what these tech whispers really do to the listener. They make you curious. They make you look closer. They remind you that the past is not primitive. It is practical, inventive, and often elegant. One interpretation is that the fascination with advanced ancient technology is a modern emotional need. People want the past to feel like a hidden library, because that makes the present feel less lonely. A more cautious explanation could be that humans simply love puzzles, and ambiguous objects invite stories. Both can be true. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm about specific odd artifacts and the full range of techniques that never survived. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are calm imagination. You let your eyes rest on a simple tool, a straight edge, and you realize that the most powerful technologies are often not mysterious at all. They are the ones that teach hands to be consistent, minds to be patient, and communities to agree on what counts as real. You walk into a quiet, open space at the edge of the city where the ground rises just enough to give you a view. The air is dry and the horizon is wide, from here. The city's buildings look like a cluster of steady shapes, and beyond them the plain stretches out, flat and patient, like it has watched too many human plans to be impressed. The rivers glitter in the distance, and you can almost feel time moving the way water moves, slow, persistent, shaping everything without asking permission. Now, the phrase seventh civilization enters your mind like a soft bell tone. It is not carved on a monument here. It is not shouted by a priest. It is a modern way of naming a feeling, the feeling that history is layered, that cultures rise and sink and rise again, leaving traces that later people step on without noticing. What's broadly accepted is that the land between the rivers holds many layers of settlement, with towns and cities rising, shifting, rebuilding, and sometimes being abandoned and resettled. Archaeology suggests that tells those mound-like hills form from generations of building, collapse, and rebuilding in the same place. The evidence we do have points to continuity and replacement stacking like bread layers, one on top of another. You can stand on a mound and realize you are standing on centuries of floors, hearths, broken pots, and forgotten footsteps. One interpretation is that when ancient scribes describe the deep past, they may be responding to this physical reality. They live in a world where the ground itself is an archive. A careful reading might suggest that their stories of ancient ages, great flood, and shifting kingship capture the sense that the present rests on buried worlds. A more cautious explanation could be that myths of previous ages are common across cultures and arise from human imagination and moral storytelling, not from specific archaeological awareness. Both can be true. People do notice ruins. People also enjoy dramatic origin stories. You kneel and pick up a shard of pottery. It is small, with a worn edge. The surface is plain, but it holds a quiet fact. Someone once used this. The city's ground is full of these tiny fragments. each one a broken sentence of daily life. You turn it in your fingers and feel the faint grit. You could make a wild claim that this shard belongs to a lost super-civilization. Or you could accept the mainstream truth. It belongs to ordinary people doing ordinary things in a particular era. The ordinary is not boring. The ordinary is the whole point. Historians still argue whether the strongest driver of cultural change in early Mesopotamia is sudden disruption like invasion or collapse, or slow evolution through trade, environment, and internal social shifts. You let that debate settle in the warm air. It matters, because it shapes how you interpret the idea of numbered civilizations. If change is mostly slow, then seventh might be a poetic way of naming gradual transformations. If change is punctuated by collapses, then seventh might reflect a sense of repeated resets. The evidence we do have points to both patterns appearing at different times, gradual shifts in material culture and administration, and occasional dramatic disruptions that reorder power. Now you follow the concept inward. What if the seventh civilization is not a historical count, but a mental category? People notice that their world has older ruins in it. They notice ancient foundations. They hear stories of earlier kings. They see old canals filled with silt. The land whispers, others were here, and they are gone. One interpretation is that this awareness can generate a worldview of cycles. A careful reading might suggest that when a society imagines previous ages, it is also preparing itself emotionally for the possibility that its own age will someday become a layer beneath someone else's feet. That is interpretation, but it feels psychologically plausible. A more cautious explanation could be that people in any era project backwards because the past is a useful stage for teaching lessons. You tell a story about a previous age to warn about arrogance, to praise piety, to explain suffering, or to justify authority. The deep past becomes a mirror. You walk toward a low mound. Not huge, but clearly unnatural. It rises out of the plain like a slow wave that decided to freeze. You climb it carefully. The soil is crumbly, full of tiny bits of fired clay. This is a mainstream anchor. Settlement mounds form from repeated building and rebuilding. The evidence we do have points to long human presence in these landscapes. Cities do not simply appear and vanish without leaving layers. At the top, you sit and let the wind move past your ears. The sound is soft, and it makes you feel like the world is inhaling. You look out and imagine how many lives have happened in this same view. A child chasing a goat, a worker carrying a basket, a trader scanning the horizon, a guard watching for dust, a priest interpreting an omen, a scribe counting rations. None of them think of themselves as a numbered civilization. They think of themselves as people trying to get through the season. Here is your first small joke in this section. Gentle and modern. You imagine someone in the city trying to label their era as the seventh, and another person responding, "I can barely count my sheep. Please do not ask me to count civilizations." The first person insists anyway, because humans love labels, and the second person goes back to sheep, because sheep do not care. Now, you examine what Sumerian records might quietly suggest. Staying honest with the truth ladder. Documented. The texts include mythic deep time, king lists with long reigns, flood narratives, and language about shifting authority. Interpreted. One interpretation is that these elements preserve a cultural sense of layering and cycles. Imagined, what if seventh is a code word for remembering? Not remembering facts like a ledger, but remembering that everything built can be unbuilt, and everything stable can become fragile. You tilt your head and notice that the number 7 itself carries a certain human magnetism. Across many cultures, 7 appears in patterns, rituals, and storytelling. It is often treated as complete or significant. That does not mean it is a literal historical count. A careful reading might suggest that using 7 can be symbolic, a way of saying many with a sense of order. A more cautious explanation could be that modern storytellers are the ones emphasizing 7, because modern minds like neat categories and dramatic titles. The evidence we do have points to humans in every era enjoying numbers that feel meaningful. Now the mystery lane arrives, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that the 7th civilization refers to an actual sequence of advanced global cultures, each rising and being wiped out by catastrophe, leaving only faint traces. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often lacks firm archaeological support. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a storytelling prompt. What would a truly lost civilization leave behind? It would need durable materials, consistent global markers, and clear stratigraphic evidence. The reason the idea stays fringe is that the strongest evidence for ancient Mesopotamia is local continuity and regional change, not clean global resets. Still, the idea persists because it scratches an itch. It makes history feel like a mystery novel with missing chapters. And missing chapters are irresistible. You stand and walk down the mound, and your feet disturb small bits of pottery in the dust. This is where you ground yourself again. Archaeology does not only chase grand mysteries, it rebuilds daily life from fragments. It tells you what people ate, how they built, how they traded, how they measured, how they buried, how they worshipped. The evidence we do have points to complexity growing through human choices and environmental pressures, not through a single hidden revelation. One interpretation is that the quiet suggestion in Sumerian records is not, there was a secret superior civilization, but there were worlds before us, and there will be worlds after us. The past becomes a moral landscape. If you build wisely, you last longer. If you ignore limits, you suffer. A more cautious explanation could be that the texts are doing what texts often do, reinforcing order by telling stories about order. Here comes your second small joke, soft and sleepy. You imagine a scribe trying to summarize centuries of messy history and choosing the easiest sentence. Kingship moved. A flood happened, and everyone learned a lesson. It is the ancient version of saying, long story short, and then somehow the story is still very long. You keep walking until you reach a canal edge. The water reflects the sky. A bird skims the surface and leaves a brief ripple. Then the ripple disappears. That ripple is a good metaphor for civilizations. They make a pattern in the world, and then the pattern fades, but the water continues. Now you allow one cinematic what-if, clearly framed as imagination. What if a scribe, late at night, looks at old ruins and thinks, we are not the first to build here. What if they choose a sacred number, like 7, as a way to suggest completeness, a full set of ages behind them? They do not write it as a code for outsiders. They write it as a quiet comfort. History is deep, and we are part of it. Not alone. A more cautious explanation could be that such a thought is entirely modern and not present in the ancient mind. That is possible too. Inner thoughts do not fossilize easily. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm about how ancient people conceptualized time beyond their own political and ritual horizons. Your third joke arrives gently. You imagine trying to explain to someone in the city that thousands of years later, people will obsess over their tablets, their pots, their walls, and their myths. They blink and say, that is nice. But do you have any spare barley? It is a reminder that survival is always the most immediate philosophy. You stop and let your breathing slow. The concept of seventh civilization does not need to be literal to be meaningful. The solid ground is layering. Continuity and the documented presence of many cultural phases in the region. The interpretation is that mythic deep time and symbolic numbers reflect a sense of cycles. The imagined mood is that there is a quiet message in the way people talk about ages and floods. Build. Remember. Stay humble. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are calm imagination. You do not need a single hidden truth. You only need to accept that history is a landscape of layers, and that the human mind, staring into layers, naturally invents numbers and stories to make the depth feel graspable. You walk into a space that feels like the end of a long day, even if the sky outside is still awake. It is a quiet room where tablets are stored, not stacked in dramatic piles, but arranged with the calm logic of people who understand that order is a kind of shelter. The air is dry, the light is soft. A single lamp makes the clay surfaces glow faintly, as if each tablet is holding a small ember of memory. Most historians agree that the Sumerian language gradually stops being spoken as a daily community language, even while it continues to be used in learned, religious, and administrative contexts for a long time. The evidence we do have points to language shift happening alongside political change and the rise of other languages in the region. This is not unusual in history. Languages evolve, merge, and yield ground, sometimes gently, sometimes under pressure. And yet, there is something quietly moving about a language becoming, in a sense, ceremonial, like a song remembered long after the singer is gone. You lift a tablet carefully in your imagination. It is cool and firm, and the marks are still sharp enough to catch a tiny shadow. It is easy to think of writing as permanent, but even clay can break. Even archives can burn. Even libraries can be looted. What survives is never the whole story. It is a selection made by accident, by preservation conditions, by excavation, and by the choices of ancient record keepers themselves. One interpretation is that what survives tends to favor institutions, temples, palaces, administrations, schools. A careful reading might suggest that the quietest records are often the most intentional, not quiet in content, but quiet in purpose. A ration list, a contract, a school exercise, a hymn copy. These texts are not trying to impress you. They are trying to function. And because they function, they reveal the bones of daily life. A more cautious explanation could be that what survives is not always what was most intentional, but simply what was most likely to be stored and preserved. Both ideas can be true. Still, when you look at the tablets, you feel a kind of honesty. Grand propaganda exists. Yes, but so does the humble fact of counting, naming, and recording. Historians still argue whether the decline of Sumerian city dominance is best explained by environmental stress, shifts in trade and political power, or the cumulative effects of conflict and administrative complexity. You let that debate rest like a folded blanket. It is not a debate that needs a single winner. Civilizations rarely fall for one reason. They strain in multiple places. Water systems need maintenance. Fields can suffer from salt buildup. Political alliances shift. Military pressure rises. Internal administration can become heavy. The evidence we do have points to change over time, not a single dramatic switch being flipped. You walk along the shelves. Some tablets carry formal language, careful and ceremonial. Others are brisk and practical. You imagine a scribe finishing a line, smoothing the clay edge with a thumb, then setting it down to dry. The scribe does not know which tablet will survive. That uncertainty is part of the atmosphere here. The room feels like a lottery of memory. Now the idea of last tablets comes into focus, but you treat it gently. There is rarely a final page in history. There are late phases, transitions, replacements, and continuities. Even when a language fades from daily speech, its traces can remain in ritual, in scholarship, in borrowed words, in copied forms. The evidence we do have points to continuity through scribal tradition, especially as later cultures preserve older texts for prestige and learning. One interpretation is that later scribes treat Sumerian as a sacred or classical language, the way some societies treat ancient liturgical languages. A more cautious explanation could be that it is simply useful for certain institutional tasks and continues because institutions value stability. Either way, Sumerian becomes a kind of cultural anchor, even as political reality changes. You pause at a tablet that seems like a prayer or a hymn copy. It reminds you that people do not only record commerce, they record longing, they record gratitude, they record fear. The evidence we do have points to a world where writing becomes a vessel for meaning, not just management. Now the mystery lane enters one last time, careful and calm. A popular rumor claims that certain final texts contain hidden warnings, coded messages meant for future ages, or deliberate concealments about events too dangerous to name. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a thoughtful question. Do people ever hide meaning in plain sight? Yes, they do. They write in allegory, in metaphor, in ritual language, in polite euphemism. But that does not mean every quiet line is a secret code. Often, quiet lines are quiet because they are routine. Here is your first small joke in this section, soft and sleepy. You imagine a modern viewer begging for a hidden prophecy, and an ancient scribe responding with the most ancient possible sarcasm. The hidden message is that you still owe barley. You take a slow breath and let the room's calm settle you. The solid ground is clear. Sumerian records show a complex society with institutions. Religion, trade, education, law, and myth. The interpretation is where the quiet suggestions live. That texts are not neutral, that they shape legitimacy, that myths reflect psychological and social realities, that numbers can be symbolic, that architecture and writing can train behavior. The imagined lane is the cinematic mood. What if some scribes sense they are living on a layer of layers, and they write with a faint awareness of impermanence? You walk toward the doorway. Outside, you can hear the city's night sounds, a distant laugh, a jar being set down, a dog giving a half-hearted bark, as if even it is tired. You think about how much of civilization is simply people repeating tasks while telling stories to keep their hearts steady. Here comes your second small joke, gentle and modern. You imagine a god of record looking at all the tablets and thinking, I asked for devotion, and you gave me spreadsheets. Then you remember that spreadsheets are basically devotion in modern form, and you feel strangely seen. You step into the open air and look up at the sky. Stars are scattered in a way that makes patterns easy to invent. People in every age look up and search for meaning. Some meanings become myths, some become measurements, some become comfort. Most historians agree that later cultures in Mesopotamia inherit and transform earlier traditions, building on them rather than erasing them completely. The evidence we do have points to continuity of ideas, rituals, and administrative practices, even as languages and dynasties change. That is one of the most soothing truths in history. Endings are rarely total. They are transitions, One interpretation is that this is what the Sumerian record quietly suggests at its core. Not a single secret, not a hidden visitor, not a neat count of civilizations, but a pattern. People build structures of meaning to survive uncertainty. They write to hold memory. They worship to manage risk. They argue, negotiate, adapt, and keep going. A more cautious explanation could be that we see this pattern because we want to. It is possible that the ancient experience is more alien than our interpretations allow. That is fair. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm about inner lives. Now you let the final cinematic possibility appear, clearly marked as imagination. What if there is a moment, late at night, when a scribe finishes a tablet and sits quietly, stylus resting in their palm? They listen to the city's distant water and footsteps. They do not know the future. They do not know empires will rise and fall. They only know they are part of something larger than a single life. And for a breath, they feel both small and steady. You turn back toward the room one last time, then let your gaze soften. You do not need to solve every question. You can let the unanswered parts exist without anxiety. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are calm imagination. And now, as you begin to drift toward sleep, you let the tablets remain what they are, clay pressed with human intention, quiet but persistent, like a heartbeat that continues even when you stop listening. Now the pacing slows, and the night becomes gentler. You feel your shoulders drop, not because the world has become perfect, but because you're allowed to rest inside it. The lamplight in your mind softens, and the sharp edges of questions blur into something kinder. You imagine the rivers again, not as threats, but as steady movement, a sound that never hurries you. The water does not demand answers. It only flows, carrying silt, carrying reflections, carrying the quiet proof that time can be both relentless and soothing. You breathe in slowly, and the air feels clean in your chest. You breathe out, and the thoughts in your head loosen like knots. The city in your imagination quiets too. Doors close, footsteps fade. Even the anxious parts of your mind find a corner to sit down and stop pacing. You let yourself think of the people who shaped clay and wrote marks into it, not as distant mysteries, but as tired humans who wanted their world to hold together. They wanted food to last. They wanted water to come at the right time. They wanted their children to grow. They wanted stories that made loss bearable and joy meaningful. That is enough. It has always been enough. Your eyelids feel heavier now, and you do not fight it. Sleep is not a surrender tonight. It is a gentle return. You allow the remaining questions to float like small leaves on water, drifting away from you, not because they are unimportant, but because you do not need them right now. The darkness around you feels safe. The silence feels friendly. Your breathing becomes the only rhythm you have to follow, slow and steady. And somewhere far away in time, a tablet rests on a shelf, holding its marks without needing anyone to stare at them. The past stays where it is, quiet and patient. You stay where you are, warm and soft, letting the night carry you.